I think this leads in perfectly to our next caller, actually, who is Eric in West Virginia, who has a question that I think will tie into this very nicely. Eric, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. How are both of you doing?
Doing well. Excited to talk to you. What have you got for us?
All right. So, I recently watched your videos on Faith and Logic, the book that you was reading. I had watched Mr. Kool-Aid's video with Murphy, and they had their conversation with Darth Dawkins.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been an atheist for about 15 years in southern West Virginia, so that's lonely enough as it is. But I've been around long enough to see like all the scientific arguments that Christians use, all of the historical arguments that Christians use. But now I'm starting to notice that a lot of them are using philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never really had much intake into reading or understanding philosophy or even how it's used in an argumentative sense.
Mm-hmm.
So when I hear things like the philosophical argument for the first cause, like what you guys were talking about in your last call there, or any of these other things, there's even a vegan called Ask Yourself that uses only philosophical argumentation for veganism and all these other things. Especially Darth Dawkins uses it, or at least he attempts to.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like that the counter to all of this is that they're doing it wrong. And then I hear, like, you guys give your counters. It's actually supposed to be this, all those other things. So I'm basically completely clueless when it comes to philosophy and how it's used in argumentation. And since both of you seem to have much more experience with it, if you could explain it to me, just kind of like a basic understanding as to why you think Christians are using this route towards argumentation now, and they're seeming to stick with it longer.
That's a really good question. Thomas, what do you think?
Because they don't have anything else. Like
yeah,
they literally
it's a
don't.
Short
like,
answer.
If you look at you look at the National Academy of Sciences, and you look at what percentage of the top physicists, like in the U.S., what percentage of them hold to a belief in an interactive God that like created the universe and stuff. And it's astronomically low. I think there's like 2% or something. Like almost all of the physicists who are, actually, making a dent in the field, that there's plenty of other explanations that they don't need God to explain it. And there's so many things that have previously been attributed to God that can be shown to be not true and can easily be debunked and disproven as soon as you start getting into like the upper echelons of like learning when it comes to physics. And the same is true with biology and with evolution and with abiogenesis and stuff. Like there are very, very, very few people, and I think they're pretty much all of them work for like Answers in Genesis, maybe like for Kent Hovind, who have any kind of training in these fields who actually argue in favor of like young earth creationism or a literal God of the Bible or a literal God of the Quran. Like you just don't see it. And the same is often true with historians and archaeologists. You start going back in time and it's like, okay, I think that there's enough evidence to say that there probably was a guy named Jesus who existed. It's not the greatest evidence. I'm doing a video on it right now and I'm comparing it to the evidence for other historical figures. And I think that the evidence for Jesus should be much greater if he was a god, but there's no evidence that is anything remotely convincing enough to show that he rose from the dead, that he worked these miracles, all this stuff. And there's so much that we know about human psychology where, people can lie, they can exaggerate, they can misremember, they make up stories change as they're retold, as they're translated, as they're copied. Like there's so many ways to explain how a cult leader can develop a following, similar to, Joseph Smith or L. Ron Hubbard or Satya Sai Baba or all of the cult leaders that we know are BS right now in the 21st century or in the last, 100 years or two. And we know that a lot of stories spring up around them about miraculous accounts that are BS, and yet millions of people follow them. And so like on all of these fronts, whether it's history or whether it's science or anything else, it's so easy to just rip it to shreds if you do, a little bit of research and you look into it. And so they have to turn to philosophy because, they can philosophically reason God into existence because they have no other evidence. There's no way to concretely show that God exists or that a particular religion is true. And so they have to kind of dance around and find a little bit of, philosophical, logical arguments here or there to build their case. And even then, most philosophers will, take them to task. It's harder to respond to if you aren't versed in, logic and philosophy.
So what is it? So let me ask you this. Let's keep the Christian argumentation out of it. What is the benefit to understanding or learning philosophical argumentation unless you are wanting to be a philosopher as like maybe a job or something like that?
Awesome question. I'll jump in here because this is my favorite thing to talk about. So there are a couple benefits to learning philosophical argumentation, and I do want to parse that apart a little bit as well. There is formal logic, right? There are formal studies in philosophy that I personally have only dabbled in and do not have a large breadth of knowledge in. This would look like when you graph a logical argument with numbers and with letters and symbols, and like it looks like math essentially, right?
Right.
That can be super fun. I know people who love it. I know people who are really good at it. I would love to get better at it, but that's not really what we talk about when we talk about philosophical argumentation and logical fallacies and all of this. What we talk about is informal logic, informal argumentation. And what that looks like is pretty much just agreeing to the rules as two people having a conversation. And there are some rules that are just kind of inherent in good conversation, right? You shouldn't attack the person if what you really want to attack is the position, right? That's an ad hom. You shouldn't pretend like somebody is an expert in something they're not and just rely on that expertise to prove your point without doing any of, additional proving. That's the argument from authority or appeal to authority.
Like the book you were reading on your YouTube videos recently.
Exactly.
He's an astrophysicist trying to argue for biology.
Oh my goodness. You just get me off on that tangent for forever. But exactly that. So there are some rules that we have agreed on as a species that really likes to argue with each other, make good arguments and not so good arguments. And some people just aren't well versed in this, and so they will accidentally use fallacious reasoning in their arguments. And it can be very helpful to get to the bottom and come to a consensus if you can say, oh, hey, I know that you're saying this thing, but actually here's the problem with it, right? And it's not just saying, oh, well, that's a fallacy. Moving on, you're dumb, right? It's, oh, here's the problem with that kind of reasoning and why it doesn't actually do what you think it does. Let's find another way to get to that conclusion that uses better, methods. So for me, that's been the primary benefit of learning all of this. It's fun, but most of it is coming from this place of really being able to get to where the other person is on the same page as you and having a really good conversation that doesn't get stuck in the weeds on a random piece of illogic that sneaks in either intentionally or not. And that's the other side of this. And then I'll get off my soapbox. The other side of this is it's very useful because a lot of people who do know about these fallacies about how to argue do it intentionally, right? A lot of the people who will argue for things like the existence of God, not all of them, but a lot of them do use fallacies intentionally with the hope that the other person doesn't pick up on it and is convinced. So the goal there is not just to facilitate understanding with honest interlocutors, but also to be able to call out a dishonest interlocutor if you come across that person and they're trying to convince you of something that you shouldn't be convinced by. If you're able to say, oh, here are the 3 reasons that is a crap argument, then all of a sudden you have to come together and have a better conversation, and they can't rely on their script anymore.
Yeah. You run into that when you would listen to like Seitan Kate. He hasn't been around for a while, but
God, yes.
Darth Dawkins, the one, the Kiwi preacher that runs Ray Comfort. He does something. He tries to do something different.
Yes, exactly. They have their script and it's full of holes, but if they go fast enough and if they talk only to people who can't pinpoint where those holes are, even if they kind of know, like sometimes you'll listen to these people and you'll be like, that sounds wrong. I don't know why, but that's not
something's
convincing.
off. I just can't put my finger on it.
Right, exactly. I don't know if I agree with that, but I don't know why. It helps when you can actually identify it and be like, oh, That's because that's this problem that you're introducing into this conversation. That's why I reject this argument. Try again with something else. But yes, exactly. Cy Templeton-Kate, Ray Comfort, Ken Ham, William Lane Craig, everybody, Alvin Plantinga, don't even get me started. They all utilize these, and they might be honestly convinced by it. I don't want to say that they're all pulling cons. I know some of them definitely are, but I don't know. Maybe they're really convinced by it because they've bought into their own script. Either way, it can be really useful when having conversations with them to be able to pinpoint where there are problems. And that's really, for me, the biggest use of any kind of philosophical argumentation.
I do appreciate you guys putting this show together and everything, because, like I said, I've been watching atheist YouTube videos for a long time and just listening to new voices and everything, not just Aaron Ron, Matt Dillahunty over and over again. But if you two happen to, I knew that Kool-Aid, you've already had an encounter with Darth Dawkins.
Yeah.
If I ran into someone like that in real life, like some crony of his that has just repeated his script and everything, since I'm not very voiced in or learned in that kind of non-official kind of philosophy, argumentation, or whatever, is it even worth attempting a conversation with them, because they're just going to stay on their script and I'm just going to be a loser that falls into the trap?
That's a really good question.
I think you have to gauge the person on a one-by-one case. If you're having a conversation with you and they just want to railroad you and get through their script and then like dance around like they won, then you're basically playing pigeon chess, which, you know, pigeon chess is like, you know, if you play chess with a pigeon, it's going to knock over the pieces, crap on the board, and then strut around like it won the game. And you're not actually getting anywhere. So if you're having a conversation with someone like that, then my advice would be like, you're probably wasting your time. But if you're having a conversation with someone who genuinely seems interested in the truth and is honest and is fair, then yeah, absolutely have the conversation and they can present the arguments. And you know, if you're not well versed in them, that's fine. You can you can say, you know, hey, I might need to look into this more. But I feel like philosophically, you know, you can reason anything into existence. You can reason a unicorn that created everything into existence. So let's look at what evidence we have for God, actual tangible proof, and let's try to break that down and see how reliable it is. Is it based on some second or third hand account? Is it this ancient account that can't be verified? Has it been tested? If it has been tested, like what were the methods that were used? Was it published? Was it peer reviewed? If not, like what are some of the flaws that we might be able to better understand where these accounts are coming from, and why is it that, you know, it's not universally accepted and that people aren't, you know, that the expert consensus isn't that this miracle is real or that God exists or stuff like that. Like let's actually look at the evidence for it and break it down. And if you don't know, say, that's interesting, I'll have to look into it more. And then go and look into it more and see, like, what are the responses to it? What are people saying that are countering the claim, and what's the claim being made? Because some of the claims are convincing. You know, if someone makes a claim that, you know, on the atheist side, I've heard people say, well, Jesus didn't exist because Nazareth didn't exist. But then, like, you talk to archaeologists and, like, they found Nazareth. They dug exactly where they expected it to be. They found towns dating to the 1st century. They found, you know, exactly what they would expect to find. And it's like, you know, did it have Nazareth written on it? No, but it's like, it doesn't really... The argument that Nazareth just doesn't exist, it's not convincing. Yeah. And so I'm happy to cede that point to you know, the Christians or the creationists or whatever, because I don't think that it's a good argument against, you know, Jesus or the existence of Jesus. But there's plenty of other reasons. That's not the sole reason why I don't think that Jesus rose from the dead. You know, so just understanding your position and theirs and trying to figure out, like, what are their best arguments? What are the responses to them? And are they good, solid reasons to believe and take the claims that they're making and to accept them?
Right.
that kind of reminds me of that one argument that I heard some people say, is that because X place in the Bible or X places in the Bible were real, then Jesus was real, or Jesus existed. And then the counter is like, well, Spider-Man is set in New York. New York's a real place, but that doesn't make Spider-Man real. So
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't really work on either end, I would say.
Yeah.
But the only other thing I would say here is my go-to, because I don't understand all of philosophy, right? Like, I could stand to learn a whole lot more, and there are probably a lot of theists who know more actual philosophy than I do. But what I tend to do in those situations is to be like, okay, break this down for me like I'm 5 years old, and just ask questions. Why? Like, what is that definition? Why is that the definition? How did you come to that conclusion? Right? Make them get off of their script and sit with you and actually explain it. And if they can, and it's convincing, then cool, you had a really good conversation and you've got more stuff to chew on. But more often than not, what they're relying on is that freeze response where the other person is like, oh, that's a word I don't know. And then they get to continue on with their script and pretend like they won the argument, when in fact you just froze because you're like, oh, I'm out of my depth. Don't be afraid to jump in there and just ask questions, because worst case scenario, you learn something new, right? Best case scenario in many conversations with theists is they realize that their script isn't going to work and they have to engage honestly with you. So yeah, just ask questions if you want to engage, but don't feel pressured to. Like, if somebody's trying to get you into a conversation that you're not interested in, then just feel free to walk away. That is not impolite. That is your right to do.
I've gone back over yours and Eric's conversation with Robin over the past 3 weeks.
Yes.
And everything was just like, okay, he's trying to go here, he's trying to railroad this in, but you guys are kind of like pulling him back and slowing him down. And then that third episode came out where you know, I saw you just flailing in your chair because you're like, I win because he did this. And I was like, oh God, okay, why did she win? What did I miss? I missed the whole. Well, I won't take up any more of your guys' time.
That's like
I
me.
think it's the end of y'all's show anyways, but I really appreciate it. I've been a long time listener, first time caller. I appreciate both your guys' works on your videos and channels and everything. Keep up the good work, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks for calling in. Feel free to call back.
I do that same thing where like I'll hear something and then and I might have it on in the background and I'm listening to it, and then there'll be like a point or like a mic drop moment. I'm like, wait, what did I miss?
What is happening?
Go back and re-listen.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that is my principle. The V principle at this point is, if you have to appeal to hard solipsism in order to win the argument, then I win the argument. If the only way that your argument makes sense is that ultimately you're a hard solipsist, then you lose.
Yeah, it's like, we can't prove that we're not a simulation or a brain in a vat or whatever else. It's like,
well,
okay, but like, you can't disprove it. You can't prove it. Like, we're both kind of back at square one. Like, what do you want to do about it?
Exactly.